Hey, welcome back, everyone. Jason Boyette is a local writer and the host of Hey Amarillo podcast. It's a weekly interview show featuring Amarillo people and stories. Some you know, some you may not know. This local podcast began in 2017 and is now in its third season. So we're excited to have Jason join us each week to chat about his podcast and the people and the places that he features. So before we get to our interview this week, tell me about how you decided to take this into a podcast form. I know you've been writing in Amarillo. You've been a mainstay here in town. How'd you come up with Hey Amarillo?
I've listened to podcasts since virtually they were invented, 10, 12 years ago. And the ones that I love are the ones that just dig deep, like talking to a person. When you spend 30 or 40 minutes just talking one-on-one with somebody, you're going to learn stuff that you might not otherwise have known reading a magazine article or seeing them on the news.
Right.
And I kept thinking, there are interesting people in Amarillo. Somebody should do a podcast about those people instead of these big national or international ones.
Right.
Well, then I decided, I guess I better be the person that does that.
So you've done it for 3 years now. One of the ones we talked about off camera being probably one of the most listened to when there was that really big issue over the ballpark, over the name, when you interviewed Tony Inzer.
Right, and he was gracious enough. I mean, this was in like 2 or 3 days after the names were announced.
In the heat of
the petition was going, you know. He was gracious enough to come on the show and talk about stuff. And I it was probably the most aggressive questioning I've done, taking the Amarillo side and saying, why are these the names? And he explained himself. Was a very popular episode. Just because people got to hear directly from him instead of just some faceless corporate villain, you know?
Right, and you've interviewed a lot of people over the years. You were telling me off camera that some of the interviews that you've done, that you've been the most fascinated ones, were about people that you didn't know who have gone through things you didn't know about.
Sure, I mean, I could talk to well-known people every week if I wanted to. But I like talking to people that have stories that are not like my story or not like your story. And that's the value of having conversations across different neighborhoods, different communities, different life experiences. You get to hear about what it's like to live in Amarillo for a whole bunch of different people. We learn about our neighbors, the ones close and the ones down the street. So let's talk about this week's interview, somebody that we know an awful lot about here on Studio 4, Jacomo. So Jacomo Bairos, he's one of those higher profile names.
Yes.
And I wanted to talk to him for a couple of reasons. Number one, you know, he's just re-signed to be the music director of the Amarillo Symphony for the next couple of years. He's a unique person in that he does not live here full time. So he's here when the symphony's planning and rehearsing, and then he lives in Miami, or he travels all over the world. And every time he travels, he's like a representative of Amarillo. That's the first line in his bio. And so I wanted to talk to him about that. He also shared with me about how he and his career have changed since he started in 2013. He was still pretty inexperienced then, and he's grown a lot. He started doing some really interesting things. And as an advocate for the arts, an advocate for Amarillo, it's just really interesting to talk to him about that.
What is the one thing about Jacomo that you were most surprised that you didn't know prior to the podcast on Hey Amarillo?
He is really into yoga, which is not something he does typically while directing, you know, a symphony.
Right.
And hearing him talk, you know, some about his personal journey, about the way that he's grown since he was like this young upstart, you know, director coming in, and now he's got more experience. He's learning to really embrace a lot more different creative opportunities.
Well, you have given us an opportunity to kind of dive in with you along on Hey Amarillo. So tell everybody where we can go and we can find your podcast.
Okay, you can always find the website at heyamarillo.com. If you have an app like Apple Podcasts or Stitcher or Google Play, just search for Hey Amarillo. It should pop up. You can subscribe, dig through the archives, listen to as many as you want.
And if you're like us, I love podcasts. I can't get enough of it. And it's always great if I go on a trip to dial it in, or if I've just got 30 extra minutes to tune into a podcast. Jason, thank you so much for being on the show. And we're going to have him on regularly. So make sure you stay tuned to find out what is next on Hey Amarillo.
Every week.
All right, Jason, thank you. Coming up next, the time change. Oh, it is